Amelia believed her private jet had died right before the biggest deal of her life. 3 engineering teams had already given up. The board was preparing to remove her. Her rivals smiled like a man who had already won. Inside the freezing hangar, Mason, a single father dismissed as a lowly mechanic, simply rested his palm against the engine casing, listened for a few quiet seconds, then lowered his head. He did not say the engine was broken. He whispered a single sentence that forced every security camera in the building to be reopened immediately. It had been sabotaged deliberately. The private airfield outside Denver was silent in the hour before dawn, the kind of silence that came only with cold rain and empty runways. Floodlights washed the tarmac in a flat, clinical white, and under that light sat an $80 million jet that was supposed to carry Amelia Sterling toward the most important signature of her career. She stood at the base of the boarding stairs in a charcoal coat, watching her breath fog in front of her, going over the New York contract one more time in her mind even though she already knew every clause by heart. In a few hours she was meant to sign an agreement that would pull Sterling Aerospace back from the edge of a hostile takeover, the company her father had built from a single hangar and a stubborn belief that good engineering could outlast bad luck. The jet did not agree with her schedule. The engines refused to catch, sputtering through 3 failed starts before falling into a string of error codes that no one in the hangar could fully explain. 3 separate teams of senior engineers crawled over the aircraft in turn, running diagnostics, swapping fuses, rechecking fuel lines, and each team arrived at the same flat conclusion. The central control assembly was dead, and there was no way to replace it before the flight window closed. Connor Blake, the company's chief operating officer, moved through the chaos with a calm that did not match the moment, his voice smooth as he suggested, more than once, that Amelia simply cancel the flight and let the New York deal slip to another quarter. The board did not wait for her to decide on her own. A video call lit up the side office, 4 faces stacked on a screen, all of them reminding her in careful corporate language that a missed signing would be read as weakness, and that weakness at the top had a way of becoming a vote of no confidence. Amelia listened, jaw tight, aware that every minute she spent listening to them was a minute the jet sat broken on the tarmac. It was in the middle of that pressure that Mason Carter walked into the hangar, a contracted mechanic in a faded work jacket that had seen better winters, carrying a toolbox that looked older than some of the engineers standing around him. Security barely glanced at his badge before waving him toward the loud cluster of technicians, and one of the senior engineers muttered something about outside labor being a waste of time on a job this serious. Jackson Reed, the company's chief engineer, recognized something in the way Mason moved toward the engine, a steadiness that reminded him of military maintenance crews he had trained alongside years earlier, but he kept the thought to himself for the moment. Amelia did not trust Mason at first. He carried no impressive title, no laminated certification stapled to his jacket, nothing that matched the polish of the men arguing around him. What caught her attention instead was the absence of panic in him, the way he stood at the edge of the noise and simply watched the aircraft, as though it were trying to tell him something the others had stopped listening for. When he finally asked, quietly, for permission to listen to the engine one more time, without tearing the whole assembly apart, she found herself nodding before Connor could object. He stepped past the engineers without ceremony, laid his palm flat against the cold metal of the engine casing, and closed his eyes. For a long moment nobody in the hangar spoke, as if his stillness had borrowed the silence of the runway outside. He felt for the faintest tremor under his hand, something almost too small to register, and what he found there did not match the signature of a part that had simply failed on its own. He straightened slowly, looked at Amelia rather than at Connor, and said the words that would change the next several days of her life. The jet had not died of natural causes. It had been sabotaged from the inside. Connor let out a short, dry laugh, the kind designed to make a room agree with him before anyone could think too hard. He asked Mason, with theatrical patience, what credentials gave a contracted mechanic the right to accuse anyone of sabotaging a CEO's private aircraft. Mason did not raise his voice and did not argue the point directly. Instead, he pointed out 3 small details that had nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with attention. A panel edge wiped suspiciously clean of the usual grease and fingerprints, a sensor wire pressed into an unnatural angle that no vibration could have caused on its own, and an error code that had appeared precisely after the previous night's maintenance shift, rather than building gradually the way real wear and tear would. The senior engineers in the hangar went quiet, because the details were so small that only someone who had spent years with his hands inside aircraft like this one would have noticed them at all. Amelia asked Mason to explain further, cutting through Connor's protests with a raised hand. Mason said that if the failure had occurred naturally, the diagnostic log would show a slow chain of related warnings building toward collapse. What the log actually showed was a single isolated fault, engineered to look exactly like an accident rather than grow into one. Connor tried again to diminish him, calling him an outside hire with no real stake in the company and no business-making accusations that could damage anyone's reputation. A younger engineer, less careful with her words than the others, mentioned that Mason had once worked at a small independent shop known for rescuing engines that larger manufacturers had already written off as unsalvageable. Mason did not confirm or deny it. He kept his eyes on the engine, his manner modest, offering nothing about his own history that he had not been asked for directly. Amelia's suspicion began to shift in a different direction entirely. She remembered almost offhand that it had been Connor who pushed hardest to bring in a new overnight maintenance crew only weeks earlier, replacing a team that had serviced the aircraft without incident for years. She said nothing about it yet, but the memory settled into her like a splinter. Mason asked for something simple and immediate. Seal off the maintenance bay, pull every camera feed connected to it, and let no one touch the electrical systems until the area had been properly documented. Connor objected fiercely, insisting that locking down the hangar would only delay the flight further and make the company look paralyzed at the worst possible moment. For the first time since the engines had failed, Amelia made a decision that did not run through Connor at all. She ordered the hangar locked, and she ordered it done immediately. The order itself felt strange in her mouth, heavier than the dozens of decisions she signed off on in any ordinary week, because this was the first time in months that she had chosen instinct over the comfortable, well-rehearsed voice of her own chief operating officer. Around her, the engineers shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to keep working on the engine or to simply wait for someone with real authority to tell them what came next. Mason did not seem to notice the discomfort in the room at all. He moved with the unhurried patience of a man who had spent years being doubted before he was ever believed, setting his tools down in a neat row along the wing, as if the hangar belonged to him rather than to a billion-dollar company. Jackson watched from a few steps back, arms folded, turning over what he had recognized earlier and not yet said aloud. He had seen men like Mason before, in hangars far less polished than this one, men who learned to read machines the way other people read faces, and who paid for that skill with very little recognition. He found himself wondering, not for the first time that morning, how someone with those instincts had ended up working contract jobs in a faded jacket instead of running a maintenance division somewhere. Connor retreated to the edge of the hangar to take a call, his voice dropping low enough that only the rain on the metal roof kept it from carrying. He returned a few minutes later with his composure rebuilt, smiling thinly at Amelia as though the whole disagreement had already been forgotten, and reminding her, almost gently, that the board would not wait forever for her to choose between instinct and certainty. The board kept calling, their patience thinning with every screen refresh, urging Amelia to abandon the hangar entirely and charter a different aircraft so the New York signing could still happen on schedule. Connor leaned into their fear, telling them loudly enough for Amelia to hear that she was gambling the company's future on the word of a poor outside mechanic instead of trusting the trained professionals already on staff. Amelia felt the pull from both directions at once, the ticking clock on her contract and the cold, growing certainty that someone inside her own company might be working against her. It was Mason who said the sentence that changed the tone of the room entirely. He told her that if someone had been willing to reach this deep into her private aircraft, their goal might not simply be a missed meeting. It might be something far worse, an outcome where she never reached New York at all because something failed while she was thousands of feet in the air rather than safely on the ground. A chill moved through the hangar at those words, settling over engineers who moments earlier had been arguing about delay costs and contract penalties. Ryan Cole, an aviation insurance investigator the company kept on retainer for incidents exactly like this one, was called in immediately, though everyone understood it would take several hours before he could physically arrive. Amelia asked Mason directly whether he could prove anything before Ryan got there. He said it was possible, but only if she gave him access to the maintenance data recorder and the secondary camera feeds that ran along the rear wall of the hangar. Connor tried to insert himself into that request. reminding her that all maintenance data fell under his operational authority and could not simply be handed to an outside contractor without proper review. Amelia studied him for a long moment, noticing, as if for the first time, just how much of the company's internal information had quietly funneled through Connor's office over the past year. She said nothing about her suspicion yet, but she nodded for Jackson to take Mason into the technical data room without further debate. Inside that room, surrounded by humming server racks and the soft blue glow of diagnostic monitors, Mason found what he had expected to find and dreaded finding at the same time. The maintenance log showed a small, deliberate gap, an inspection window that had been quietly shifted by 11 minutes, just enough time for someone to do something the official record was never meant to show. That single discrepancy, 11 minutes long, became the first true thread in an unraveling conspiracy. As Mason pulled a fragment of deleted data back from the system's backup cache, the hangar's side door opened behind them, the sound small but sharp in the quiet room, and somewhere just past midnight on the recovered timestamp, a shadow had once walked through that very door toward the engine that was now sitting dead on the tarmac. Outside, the rain had thickened into something closer to sleet, ticking against the hangar's metal skin in a rhythm that made the whole structure feel smaller than it actually was. Amelia stood near the doorway of the data room for a moment, arms wrapped around herself, watching Mason work without fully understanding the technical language moving across his screen, but understanding completely the tightening in her own chest as the picture grew clearer. She thought of her father, of the company he had handed her with more faith than instruction, and wondered, not for the first time that morning, whether she had been naive to trust the wrong people simply because they wore the right titles. Jackson lingered by the doorway as well, watching Mason's hands move across the keyboard with the same unhurried precision he had shown at the engine, and found himself thinking that whatever had happened to this man in the past, it had not dulled his instincts at all, only forced them into hiding. Somewhere down the hallway, Connor's voice carried faintly through a closed door, low and urgent, though no one could make out the words clearly enough to repeat them later. Mason worked carefully to restore what data remained, pulling the recovered fragments together on a single monitor while Jackson watched over his shoulder. The hangar's main camera had gone dark during the missing window, but a secondary lens, mounted to catch reflections off the glass wall of the side office, had kept recording without anyone realizing it. The footage was grainy and indirect, little more than a pale shape moving across reflective glass, but it was enough to show a figure in a maintenance jacket, a temporary access badge clipped to the collar, walking with quiet purpose straight toward the engine panel. Connor said immediately that the image was far too blurred to mean anything, that any conclusion drawn from it would collapse under real scrutiny. Mason was not looking at the face in the reflection at all. He was watching the hands, and he noticed that whoever had opened that panel had used their left hand to release the lower latch, a small, specific motion that only someone who already understood the aircraft's internal layout would have known to use. It was not the gesture of a stranger fumbling through an unfamiliar machine. Amelia ran through the short list in her head, the 5 people who carried clearance to that section of the hangar after hours, and the list suddenly felt much smaller and much more uncomfortable than it had an hour earlier. Mason turned his attention to the maintenance tools stored near the panel and found a screwdriver with an unusual trace of alloy worn into its tip, a metal that did not belong to any standard toolkit issued to the crew. Jackson examined it and confirmed that the alloy matched the bolts that had just been removed from the sabotaged panel. Connor's composure slipped for the first time, a flicker of irritation breaking through his careful concern for the company's reputation before he caught himself, and folded it back in outrage on Amelia's behalf. Mason explained that whoever had done this had not wanted to destroy the engine completely. They had wanted only to prevent it from starting at precisely the right moment, a fault timed to humiliate, not to harm, at least not at first. The intent, as Mason laid it out, was simple and cold. Make Amelia miss her contract, watch the company's share price slide, and open the door for an outside buyer to walk in while everyone was still distracted by an engine that looked merely unlucky. Amelia felt something shift inside her as the pieces locked into place. This had never been an accident or a mechanical failure at all. It was a calculated business maneuver dressed up as bad luck, built specifically to look like nothing more than misfortune. Mason kept working, eventually finding a sensor component that had been swapped for a counterfeit part, manufactured to look nearly identical to the genuine version but cheap enough to fail exactly when it was triggered to fail. Stamped faintly along the underside of that counterfeit part was an inventory code, the kind used internally to track which department had ordered and received a given component. When Jackson cross-referenced it against the company's purchasing system, the code traced directly back to the division Connor personally oversaw. Mason set the counterfeit part down on a clean cloth, almost gently, as though it had betrayed him personally despite being nothing more than cheap manufactured metal. Amelia stared at it for a long moment, struggling to reconcile the smooth, composed man she had worked beside for years with the cold calculation it represented. Jackson quietly photographed every piece of evidence in sequence, aware that whatever happened next would depend entirely on how carefully this trail had been documented. Connor seized on the moment to turn suspicion back toward Mason, accusing him of planting evidence himself in order to extract a large reward from a frightened CEO. Mason did not respond to the accusation at all, simply continuing his inspection of the panel as though Connor had not spoken. Amelia turned instead to Jackson and asked him plainly what he knew about the man who had quietly upended her morning. Jackson hesitated only briefly before answering. He told her that Mason had once been an exceptional aviation technician, respected within certain circles for his precision, until an accident years earlier had been blamed on him unfairly. The fallout cost him his position, his reputation, and most of the steady work he had built his career on, forcing him into a string of smaller jobs just to keep providing for his family. Jackson mentioned, only briefly and without dwelling on it, that Mason had someone waiting for him at home who depended on him, and then let the subject drop, sensing it was not his place to say more. Amelia looked at Mason differently after that, understanding now why a man with his obvious skill had chosen to stay invisible rather than chase recognition. Mason, for his part, found a faint trace of oil residue along the sensor wire, a partial print that was not yet enough on its own to convict anyone, but one more thread pulling the picture into focus. Ryan Cole finally arrived, stepping into the hangar with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen 100 suspicious incidents and trusted almost none of them at first glance. His early questions were aimed squarely at Mason, the unfamiliar outsider standing closest to the evidence. Mason answered without defensiveness, laying out his reasoning in plain, sequential terms. The missing 11 minutes in the maintenance log, the worn tool that matched the panel's hardware, the counterfeit sensor, and the inventory code that tied it all back to a single department. Ryan studied the evidence for a long moment and admitted, with visible reluctance, that the logic was sound enough to take seriously. Connor tried once more to redirect the conversation, suggesting that Amelia's judgment had simply been clouded by sympathy for a charming stranger rather than by anything resembling fact. Amelia answered him without raising her voice, telling him flatly that she was listening to evidence, not to titles or charm. Ryan pulled up the purchasing records on his own tablet and traced the inventory code back through the approval chain. The authorization had been digitally signed using credentials registered under Connor's own account. For a moment, no one in the hangar said anything at all. Amelia felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, not from shock at Connor's possible guilt, but from the slow, sickening recognition of how long she had let his calm voice guide decisions she should have questioned far sooner. She thought back over the past year, over budget approvals signed without a second glance and maintenance contracts shuffled quietly between vendors, all of it now wearing a different, darker shape in her mind. Mason said nothing to fill the silence, understanding that some realizations needed room to land on their own before anyone tried to explain them away. Connor denied everything at once, insisting his account credentials had been stolen and used without his knowledge. Mason suggested setting a trap rather than continuing to argue in circles. Announce internally that the jet had been repaired and that Amelia would still make her flight, and watch whether the saboteur, if still nearby, tried to interfere again or rushed to erase whatever evidence remained. Amelia agreed, fully aware of how exposed the plan would leave her if it went wrong. Ryan positioned hidden cameras around the maintenance bay while Jackson made a visible show of leaving the hangar for the night. Connor pretended to cooperate fully, nodding along with the plan, while quietly stepping aside to make a call on a second phone Mason had already noticed but chosen not to mention yet. The false announcement spread through the internal system within minutes, claiming the aircraft could be airborne within 40 minutes if final checks went smoothly. Not long after, a maintenance worker named Luke appeared near the parts storage area, moving with the particular nervous quiet of someone who did not want to be seen. For a moment, everyone assumed they had found their saboteur standing in plain sight. Mason watched him closely and noticed that his hands were trembling not with guilt but with plain fear, the kind that came from being caught in something far larger than he understood. Luke was stopped as he tried to retrieve a bag of components hidden earlier near the back shelving. Under questioning, he admitted he had been paid to swap certain parts but had never been told why, and that the person who hired him had used a false name while insisting that all updates be reported directly to the Chief Operating Officer's office. Connor immediately accused Luke of lying to soften his own punishment. Mason asked Luke one specific question, who had told him to disable the main camera before he began his work. Luke answered honestly that he had never touched the camera at all, and that by the time he arrived in the hangar that night, it was already dark. Mason understood then that Luke was nothing more than a small piece moved by someone else, and that the real architect of the sabotage had walked through that hangar before Luke ever set foot inside it. Luke's hands were still trembling as security led him aside, and for a brief moment his eyes found Mason's, carrying something close to gratitude, as if he understood that the quiet mechanic was the only person in the building treating him as a frightened man rather than a convenient villain. Amelia watched the exchange and felt a small, unexpected respect settle over her for Mason's restraint, the way he refused to let anger substitute for accuracy even when accuracy was the harder, slower path. Jackson returned from his pretended departure within minutes, slipping back through a side entrance the way they had planned, and immediately asked whether the hidden cameras had caught anything useful while the false announcement was circulating. Ryan confirmed quietly that they had, though he wanted to review the footage fully before saying anything more in front of Connor. While Mason worked through the evidence in the hangar, Connor was already moving against Amelia in a different arena entirely. He quietly pushed the board toward an emergency vote to suspend her authority as chief executive, arguing that she had lost control of the situation, that she was taking direction from an unknown mechanic, and that her hesitation was actively stalling a deal the company could not afford to lose. A few board members, already anxious about the company's exposure, began to lean toward his framing of events. Elizabeth Sterling called her daughter during a brief lull, her voice gentle but pointed, urging Amelia to stay clear-headed without ever telling her exactly what to do. Amelia listened, gripping the phone tightly, feeling for the first time just how easily the company her father had spent decades building could slip away from her in the space of a single difficult morning. Mason told her plainly that reacting out of fear was exactly what the saboteur wanted from her, and that panic would do more damage to her position than any single missed meeting ever could. Amelia asked him somewhat unexpectedly why he kept helping her at all when he had already been mocked, dismissed, and accused more than once that morning. Mason answered simply that he understood what it felt like to be blamed by an entire system before anyone had bothered to actually listen to the truth. The exchange settled into something quieter between them, a thread of understanding neither of them rushed to name, restrained enough that it never tipped into anything more than mutual respect. Ryan, working in parallel, discovered that Connor had met privately with a representative from a rival firm only days before the jet failed, a meeting that had never appeared on any official calendar. Amelia felt the floor shift again when she realized that the rival firm in question was the very company quietly circling Sterling Aerospace for a discounted acquisition. Mason then surfaced one more piece of audio, a distorted clip pulled from a secondary recording device, carrying a voice that sounded almost certainly like Connor's, instructing someone to make sure she never reached New York. The recording was too degraded to stand up cleanly as formal proof, but it landed heavily in the room all the same. It was at that exact moment that Connor walked back into the hangar, informing them all, with practiced calm, that the board had scheduled its vote and was prepared to remove Amelia from her position before the day was finished. Amelia felt something harden inside her at the announcement, a steadiness she had not expected to find in herself given everything the morning had already taken from her. She looked at Mason, who simply nodded once, a small gesture that carried more reassurance than any of the polished words the board had offered her all day. Outside the hangar, the sky had begun to lighten into a thin gray dawn, and somewhere beyond the runway lights, the city was waking up to a morning that had no idea yet how close one company had come to being stolen out from under the family that built it. Amelia made an unexpected demand of her own. She insisted the board hold its emergency session right there in the hangar, in front of the sabotaged jet itself, rather than over a sterile video call. Connor, assuming her desperation would only make her look weaker, agreed without much resistance. The board appeared on a large screen wheeled into the hangar, while a handful of members who lived nearby arrived in person, settling into folding chairs near the very engine that had started the entire ordeal. Connor opened by painting Amelia as overwhelmed and incapable of protecting the company's assets, a leader who had let a personal fixation distract her from the real business at hand. Someone asked why an unaffiliated mechanic was even present in a meeting of this importance, and moved to have Mason removed from the room. Amelia overruled the request immediately, naming him a technical witness whose presence she required. Mason stepped forward and laid out the entire sequence of sabotage in plain, unhurried language that anyone on the board could follow, regardless of their technical background. He explained that whoever did this had not killed the engine outright, but had instead made it appear dead at precisely the right moment, like a performance designed to convince everyone watching that nothing more sinister had occurred. He walked them through how the counterfeit component had been engineered to trigger failure exactly at startup, no earlier and no later. Jackson backed his analysis point by point, and Ryan confirmed that the pattern matched both insurance fraud and deliberate destruction of corporate property. Connor still refused to yield, insisting there was no direct evidence tying any of it to him personally. Mason played the enhanced reflection footage once more, now sharpened enough to show a clear detail that had been too faint to notice before. The figure at the panel was left-handed and wore a distinctive watch with a dark face. Amelia's eyes dropped instinctively to Connor's wrist, where the very same watch sat fastened, gleaming faintly under the hangar lights. Connor unfastened it quickly, claiming it meant nothing, that thousands of people might own a similar model. Mason delivered the final detail without raising his voice at all, a fine trace of alloy clinging to the underside of the watch band, the exact same alloy found on the sabotaged engine panel. The room went very still. Ryan stood and informed Connor, in a tone that left no room for negotiation, that he was not permitted to leave the hangar. The board members on the screen had gone quiet in a way that felt entirely different from the silence at the start of the meeting, no longer waiting to vote against Amelia but watching, almost stunned, as the man they had nearly trusted with the company's future stood exposed under the same lights that had once illuminated his confident denials. One board member finally spoke, asking in a subdued voice whether the vote to remove Amelia could simply be withdrawn from the record entirely. Amelia did not gloat. She only nodded once and asked that the meeting move forward to addressing what came next. Cornered, Connor shifted from denial to open threat, warning the board that if Amelia pressed forward, the New York deal would collapse entirely, and thousands of employees would pay the price for her stubbornness. A few board members visibly wavered, more afraid of the company's collapse than convinced of anyone's innocence or guilt. Connor pushed further, revealing that Mason had once been investigated in connection with an old aviation incident, hoping the disclosure would poison the room against the very man who had just exposed him. Mason went quiet, his jaw tightening, but he did not break. Amelia turned to him directly and asked him to tell the room, in his own words, what had actually happened in that earlier accident. Mason kept it brief. He had once discovered a maintenance failure that his superiors chose to bury rather than report, and when the truth eventually surfaced anyway, the company found it easier to sacrifice his career than to admit its own negligence. Ryan, somewhat to his own surprise, confirmed that Mason's old file contained several inconsistencies that had never been properly explained at the time. Jackson added that Mason had once single-handedly identified a flaw that saved an entire flight crew from a failure no one else had caught in time. The mood in the hangar began to shift again, respect creeping back into spaces where suspicion had briefly taken hold. Amelia recognized, with a small, cold jolt, that Connor was using the exact tactic that had destroyed Mason years earlier. Take the person telling the truth and quietly recast them as the problem instead. Mason then revealed one final discovery, a small auxiliary device hidden inside the electrical bay, designed so that if the jet had been hastily patched and rushed into the air, the device could trigger a failure mid-flight, far from any hangar or rescue crew. The room's mood turned instantly from talk of corporate sabotage to something far more dangerous, a quiet recognition that someone in this building had been willing to risk a life, not merely a contract. Amelia understood then, fully and without doubt, that if she had agreed to fly on the substitute aircraft Connor had quietly arranged for her, she might never have landed safely at all. The thought settled over her slowly, colder than the morning air outside the hangar, and for a moment she simply stood still, letting it pass through her completely before she trusted herself to speak again. Mason watched her absorb it without offering comfort he knew she did not need, understanding that some truths were better left to settle in silence than to be softened by anyone else's words. A few board members on the screen had gone pale as well, the weight of what had nearly happened finally outweighing whatever loyalty they had been ready to extend to Connor only minutes earlier. Ryan requested authorization on the spot to search the second phone Mason had quietly flagged earlier. The evidence already gathered more than enough to justify it. Connor tried to bolt from the hangar, only to find security blocking the exit before he reached the doors. Mason did not raise a hand against him, simply stepping into his path and telling him calmly that there was nowhere left for him to go. The second phone held a string of partially deleted messages exchanged with a representative from the rival firm. The messages made clear that Connor stood to receive a substantial ownership stake if Amelia were removed and the New York agreement collapsed entirely. A recovered voice recording confirmed that Connor had personally instructed Luke to swap the components and that he himself had disabled the main camera before anyone else arrived that night. The board sat in silence, slowly absorbing how close they had come to being manipulated into removing the very person trying to protect the company. Amelia did not raise her voice. She simply asked Connor why he had chosen to betray the company at all. His answer came out tangled and half-formed, an admission that he believed Amelia was too young and too idealistic to be trusted with something this large. Amelia told him, evenly, that the company had no use for someone clever enough to scheme yet small enough to betray it. Ryan took Connor into custody to continue the formal investigation. Luke was led away separately to give his statement, with the understanding that his cooperation might reduce whatever responsibility eventually fell on him. Mason walked back to the jet, removed the hidden auxiliary device from the electrical bay, and quietly restored the genuine component in its place. Jackson asked whether the aircraft could still be saved in time for anything. Mason told him the jet had never truly died at all. It had simply been forced into silence. When he finished the final connection and stepped back, the engine caught on the first try, its low, steady roar rolling through the hangar like a declaration that Amelia Sterling had not lost a single thing that mattered. The sound seemed to loosen something in the room that had been wound tight since the first failed start that morning. Engineers who had spent the early hours convinced the aircraft was finished now stood listening to its steady idle with something close to disbelief. Jackson clapped Mason once on the shoulder, a brief, genuine gesture, and told him that whatever the company decided to do next, it owed him considerably more than a contractor's wage for what he had just done. Time was still desperately short if Amelia intended to reach New York before the contract window closed entirely. Ryan cleared the aircraft for departure once a final safety sweep confirmed there were no remaining surprises hidden anywhere in the systems. Mason assumed his part in the morning had ended and made no move toward the boarding stairs, content to let the credit and the spotlight belong to someone else. Amelia stopped him before he could slip away, asking him directly to join the flight as an emergency technical advisor. Mason hesitated, uneasy with the idea of being trusted openly in front of people who only hours earlier had dismissed him as little more than hired help. Jackson told him quietly that this was exactly the moment to stop letting an old, unfair accident define the rest of his career. In the air, Amelia watched the city fall away beneath the wing and let herself feel, finally, how close she had come to losing everything by trusting the wrong person at the wrong time. Mason ran one last check on the cabin systems, his manner as unhurried in flight as it had been on the ground. Amelia asked him what he wanted once all of this finally settled. He did not ask for a large payout or a new title. He said only that he wanted his name cleared of the old accusation, and he wanted skilled people like himself to stop being treated as disposable. In New York, Amelia arrived later than planned but carried something far more valuable than punctuality: documented proof of an attempted corporate takeover built on sabotage and fraud. Her counterparts were initially irritated by the delay, but once they heard the full account, their irritation gave way to genuine respect for how she had handled the crisis. Amelia signed the agreement, and the terms ended up more favorable than originally negotiated, since the rival firm's own involvement in the scheme was already drawing scrutiny. Mason was introduced to the room as the man who had uncovered and stopped the sabotage before it could destroy the company from within. Amelia had not only saved Sterling Aerospace that day, she had taken back control of it through nothing but the truth, refusing to let fear or convenience decide her company's future for her. In the weeks that followed, Connor was formally charged with destruction of corporate property, financial fraud, and conspiracy to manipulate a major business transaction. The board issued a public apology to Amelia and restored her authority as chief executive without any remaining reservations. Amelia, rather than simply moving forward, asked that the old file on Mason's Long-Ago accident be reopened and re-examined properly. Ryan assisted with that effort and uncovered exactly what Mason had always known privately: a chain of concealed maintenance failures that had been quietly buried by people who found it easier to blame one honest technician than to admit their own negligence. Mason was publicly cleared of any wrongdoing, his name finally separated from an accusation he had carried for years without complaint. Sterling Aerospace created an independent safety division shortly afterward, and Amelia personally offered Mason the position of lead field technical director. He turned it down at first, insisting that a man like him did not belong in a boardroom surrounded by titles and polished language. Amelia told him she did not need someone who spoke beautifully in meetings. She needed someone willing to listen for the truth hidden inside the sound of a struggling engine. Mason eventually accepted, on the condition that the new division prioritized training young technicians properly and protect anyone who came forward to report wrongdoing honestly. The story closed with Mason standing inside the same hangar where it had all begun. The one silent jet now running perfectly behind him, its engine humming with the steady confidence of a machine finally allowed to speak the truth. Amelia walked toward him, no longer seeing the man she had once dismissed as a lowly contractor, but the one person who had quietly saved her entire sky when everyone else had already given up. The jet everyone believed had died that morning had never truly been broken at all. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough and honest enough to listen past the silence and hear the betrayal hiding inside it. Somewhere out on the runway, another aircraft lifted off into a clear morning sky, and Amelia found herself thinking that the company her father had built was finally, truly hers again, not because a board had voted to restore her title, but because she had learned, in one long and brutal morning, exactly whose voice deserved to be trusted. Mason closed his toolbox quietly beside her, the same worn case he had carried in at dawn, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel like a man waiting to be dismissed. If breathless twists and quiet, hard-won justice pull you in, stay with this entire story until its very last word.